Hi, welcome to our Facebook Live on Prematurity and the NICU. My name is Nancy McLaren Kennedy, and I'm a peer specialist mental health worker with Women's Mental Health at the Royal. And this Facebook Live is part of a collaboration between the Ottawa Birth and Wellness Centre and Women's Mental Health at the Royal. And so the collaboration includes Facebook Lives, such as this one, and also peer-led wellness groups for the perinatal community. So today's presenters are Elyse Banham, who is the Executive Director of the Ottawa Birth and Wellness Centre and former midwife, and she is also mom to a daughter who was born last April at 32 weeks. And our other presenter is the wonderful Julia Lauzon, who has been with the Ottawa Birth and Wellness Centre for 1 year. And she is the mom of a little girl who was born at 31 weeks. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're excited to be here.
Thanks, Nancy. I think before Elyse and I share our stories, we have a little presentation of some photos we'd like to share with everyone.
Did we want to start off crying or what?
Brings all the memories back, eh?
Oh, it really does. It really does. Well, I guess we'll jump into it. So I'm very happy to be here talking about mental health and the relationship that it has and is intertwined with in terms of prematurity in the NICU. It's certainly not something I think you can really prepare for. A bit about me, obviously, Nancy shared that I'm the current executive director of the Ottawa Birth and Wellness Center and also a former midwife who worked in the community. I had cared for people who had had premature babies, but certainly when you're going through it yourself, there is no preparing for what it looks like, what it feels like. And so I have to say that I'm really happy we're having this discussion today. And I'm really happy that Nancy from the Royal suggested that we cover this topic. So in terms of what I like to name my story, I like to name it either a series of unfortunate events or what could go wrong will go wrong, because that's certainly how it felt. My pregnancy story started off fairly normal. What I would say is that we were a bit concerned. I had previously, before this pregnancy, had suffered a loss. We suffered an ectopic pregnancy, and where I lost one of my tubes, my left tube fallopian tube to be exact. And so we were a bit concerned moving into this pregnancy that maybe we would, not be able to get pregnant, have fertility issues, etc. But luckily, apparently the right tube had a good catcher's mitt, because we were able to get pregnant, and really up until about 30 weeks, I had a very normal pregnancy. And then around 30 weeks, which is pretty much exactly when COVID hit the world. So in mid to late March, I started having some blood pressure issues. It was at the same time where, appointments were starting to get canceled and space out. And so I was checking my blood pressure at home and was seeing it rise. And then in terms of what I had hoped for, of course, being the executive director of the birth center, I was really hoping for a midwife-led birth center birth. I really had that in my head. I had a lot of milestones to still hit. I was still fairly relatively small. We hadn't had our baby shower yet, all of those things. But then on March 31st at about 1 a.m, I woke up in severe pain, and it felt like a heart attack. And to say that, I truly felt I was having a heart attack. Again, I'm a former midwife. I grabbed my Doppler, listened to the baby, knew the baby was okay, took my blood pressure, knew it was through the roof. At that point, it was about 150 on 100. And I was like, it must be a heart attack. That must be what's happening. So I called my midwife. I said, I'm meeting you at the hospital. I'm having a heart attack. I'll see you there, which is not what you're supposed to do. And certainly I would hope my clients wouldn't do that, but nonetheless, that's what I did. We ran to the hospital. My midwife joined me. Again, once we got there, the monitors went on. They did some blood work, and they did find that I had preeclampsia, and they admitted me right away. Of course, we'll talk a bit later about what COVID changed in terms of my experience, but because it was March 31st of 2020, it meant that once I was admitted and not in labor, my partner was unfortunately unable to join me. So I was 31 weeks. I had preeclampsia. I was not really certain about what the future would really look like, frankly, because it could be a wait and see. It could be a sit in the hospital for 4 weeks. It could be a, you have a baby tomorrow situation. And that uncertainty certainly brought up a lot of feelings, but specifically being confined to my room because of COVID, it really felt scary and isolating, and I felt very lonely and uncertain. And So we sat in the hospital for a few days. You would have seen some of the food I enjoyed. I have to say the food at L'Hôpital Montfort was absolutely fantastic. I had some what's it called, lasagna and Caesar salad and ice cream with every meal. It was great. I also did some workouts beside my bed because I couldn't go walking because we couldn't leave the room. So the experience there was quite lovely, even though it was very lonely and isolating. And then on the afternoon of April 2nd, the epigastric pain, that severe pain came back. So while I now knew that I wasn't having a heart attack, I was having epigastric pain because of the preeclampsia. And unfortunately, the time when it came back, the obstetricians were in surgery. So I had to wait some time for them to be able to come assess me. And at that time, I was in pretty severe, significant pain. And eventually, by the time the OBs were able to come assess me, they did the reflex test, which everyone I'm sure is used to. They hit your knee, you normally have a little reaction. Well, I had a full hyperclonic response. So my whole body reacted to my knee being hit. And that's a sign that you are really moving into severe preeclampsia and could be leading to seizures. So at that point, some really scary conversations happened. It was very clear I needed to be transferred to a higher level hospital. I was sent to the Ottawa Civic. They gave me magnesium sulfate, and that's, they're saying things like, we need to protect your brain, so we're going to give you magnesium sulfate. I was offered morphine. My blood pressure at this point was over 160 over 110. And, they start using some very scary language. And as a midwife, I understood all that language and really understood the implications of it. So it was very scary. And again, I didn't have my partner with me. So we had a very probably short, but felt like long lights and sirens transfer from one hospital to the other. I felt every bump as if it was going over a mountain. And we entered the Civic, at which point I was, they confirmed what I already knew. I was going to be having an emergency C-section, and the baby would be delivered at 32 weeks and 1 day. And so it was terrifying. It truly was. And I think back to, bringing this back to mental health, that idea of the uncertainty, the unknown, and yet while you're losing all of those things around you that you had expected, wished for, wanted, you're in the moment and you're dealing with it one foot in front of the other. And I do think that's a really good lesson for parenting. It definitely set us up for understanding the ups and downs of parenting. And so we, I had about 12 IVs at that point put into me. That's what it felt like. And we went into emergency C-section. Now, that C-section, it's scary. It absolutely was. But there was also some beauty in the chaos. The nurses were fantastic. The doctor was very clear with me. Because I didn't have a partner in the room with me, I was feeling fairly alone and exposed, if anybody's ever had a C-section. But the anesthesiologist could tell that my neck was in pain and offered to give me a neck massage through the procedure, which was fabulous. If she ever wants to leave anesthesiology, she can become a massage therapist. She was wonderful and comforting. And then our baby was born. We didn't know what the sex of the baby was going to be. So I found out at that point that Aria was a girl. And she was quickly whisked off to have resuscitation, at which point my partner, Dustin, was able to be in the room for the resuscitation. And then the rest is a little bit of a blur until I woke up kind of post. I was awake for the C-section, but I fell asleep right after and kind of woke up to learn about what had really happened. Now, at that point, Aria was admitted to the NICU. And the NICU experience is so many things. What I can say is that the nurses are fantastic in there. But it really is the unknown. And again, like I said, there's no preparing for it. And we know that uncertainty and chaos can cause mental health, anxiety, and mental health challenges. So when she was admitted to the NICU, we then had this, period where we were really at the mercy of the nurses and what they had to tell us. So the hardest parts about that journey was really seeing your little baby. And Aria was born 3 pounds, 15 ounces. So she was very small. She was about the size of my hand. And I won't talk too much about COVID because I think that's a big part of our journey. We're going to talk about it a bit later. But the big things that really stuck out was we weren't able to hold our baby until day 4 of her life, which was really challenging. It's hard. You think about that bond, that immediate skin to skin, all of those things I was really hoping for that you don't get. And yet you get these memories that are also very powerful. I think for me, the biggest challenge that no one can describe to you until you go through it, and I know, Julia, you and I have talked about it, is, I was discharged, she came Friday morning, I was discharged Sunday morning from the hospital. She stayed in the hospital. And in that drive home, when every other parent is bringing their child home if they've had a hospital birth, you normally have that baby in that car seat. And for us, I was getting into that car and my belly was empty. And it's hard to get through this without crying, but and that car seat was empty. And it's impossible to describe it because you haven't suffered a loss, but it feels like a loss when you're on that drive home, and it's the longest drive of your life. And that was truly the moment that I found the most challenging and the most foundational in understanding my experience, and that I was experiencing something that was like a loss. And then you keep going. You keep putting that right foot, left foot, right foot, left foot. You just keep going. And it meant that for the next 38 days for Aria, we had to be there for her. And of course, COVID did affect how we were there for her. I think we're both going to talk a bit about how we named our children. I have to say I was inspired by Julia's story to add this to mine. When we looked at Aria, on our list of names, we had all these beautiful, classy, I would say probably dainty names. And we looked at her and we were like, those just aren't going to do. And we started thinking of different names. And the one we chose, Aria, means lioness in Hebrew, and it means air or to breathe in Italian. And so we wanted her to be a fighter like a lioness, but also to remember to breathe because she was about to have quite the challenge with breathing over the next 38 days. Aria spent about 30 days requiring both ventilation, CPAP, BiPAP, and oxygen. She really only came off of oxygen a week before she left. It's difficult to talk about the isolation that you feel when you're going through this. People don't understand, or they try to reach out, and then there are the people who do understand and they reach out, and we'll talk a bit about that. But what I will say is through it all, it really takes a village to raise a child and to support parents, and COVID really stole that away from a lot of people. It stole a lot of things. But the NICU nurses were absolutely wonderful in how they supported us while we were there. We'll talk a bit more about resources later. And after those 38 days, we finally got to bring our baby home, and it was the best feeling to put her into that car seat and really have her come home and join us. The one piece that I'll leave us with that everybody says who's been through the NICU says, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And when you have those steps forward. And for us, those first couple of days, we had steps forward. By day 3, she was off ventilation. I took photos. You saw some of those photos of first outfit, first cuddle with mom. I took photos of her with the I came off CPAP today. And we were so excited she was doing so well. And then, of course, her oxygenation levels did not hold. And then she went back onto CPAP. And then she was on CPAP and oxygen for another 30 days. So it's the most challenging to have those setbacks in the NICU. And even though everybody tells you it's part of the journey, it is extremely difficult as a parent to have hope and then have that taken away from you over and over and over again. And frankly, that is the NICU experience. And it is why building wellness tools, it is why having support systems is so important as you go through that. And so that's our story. I know we're going to get into a little question answer period between Julie and I after she shares her story. And I look forward to answering some more questions. Julia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Elyse. It's beautiful. We're actually a few days away from my daughter's 7th birthday, which is coming up on May 24th. So it's actually 7 years ago, which sometimes feels like just yesterday, that I became a mom to an amazing little NICU warrior, as I like to call her. For me, my pregnancy had been progressing really well. I mean, I had severe nausea sort of all the time. That was affecting me, but other than that, everything was progressing smoothly. I kind of had a little routine with her at nighttime. I used to have my bath and put on lotion, and sort of we would talk to her and play music. And it was the time of the day where she was the most active and moving around, and I felt really connected with her. So one evening I was doing our little routine and I felt like she wasn't moving around the same. I wasn't feeling like those big movements. I sort of didn't think too much of it. The next day I was with a friend who had just experienced a pregnancy, as this was my first. So I sort of mentioned it to her and she said, sounded pretty normal, that as the baby was getting bigger, maybe I would be feeling the movements a little bit differently. So that consoled me until quite late that evening, kind of the same routine. And I didn't really feel the movements as much as I had previously. So it was midnight and I woke up my husband and I said, I'm probably just crazy. I just have this gut feeling. And just for my own peace of mind, I want to go to the hospital just to make sure everything is okay. You don't even have to come with me. I'm sure it's just me and it's fine. So I started getting dressed to go. And after a little sleepy realization, he woke up and thought that I was really going. And he decided to come with me, which was great. And once we got to the hospital, we just felt a huge sense of relief. Or right away, they connected us to the fetal heart rate monitor. We saw the baby's heartbeat. They kept us there for maybe about an hour just to make sure everything was okay. And then when the doctor came in to discharge me, she felt like I was maybe measuring a little bit small for my weeks gestation that I was at, which was 31 weeks. And she offered that I would come back the next day for an extra ultrasound. So I was actually excited at first because you only get so many ultrasounds during your pregnancy if everything is going smoothly. So I was excited to see, our baby on the ultrasound the next day. So I went into the hospital by myself for the ultrasound, and the technician seemed to be having some difficulties, brought in another colleague to have a look, and they didn't say too much to me. So it started, getting a little worried. And they asked that I would go back upstairs to the obstetrics, and that one of the doctors would talk to me about sort of the results. So once I got back upstairs, they admitted me, put the fetal heart rate monitor on, and actually quite quickly, a few of the doctors rushed in as our baby was having some heart decelerations. So they quickly kind of changed me, put an IV, told me, call your husband in case, things are moving quickly. So my husband came as fast as possible. And then at that point, because I was at a hospital that didn't have the level of NICU that would be needed for my 31 weeks gestation, they transferred me, like you, Elyse, very, very fast to the general hospital. So once we were at the general, the doctors and nurses, they sort of quickly reassured us that the baby wasn't coming at that moment, and that followed a few days where we did some tests, and finally they determined our baby had what's called Iugr. So it's an intrauterine growth restriction, meaning she was measuring between 27, 28 weeks, where I was at 31 weeks gestation, and she had asymmetrical fetal growth and was corded around the neck quite a few times, which was contributing to the decelerations that were happening based on sort of the restricted space that she was in. At that time, they couldn't say specifically what was causing this growth restriction, but then they started having us meet some of the staff and specialists and sort of anticipating a stay in the NICU. And it's definitely, like you said, Elyse, you know, that you can't be prepared until you're in there. And it's those days leading up that was filled with so much uncertainty, and we would ask questions that they wouldn't necessarily have the answers for because they just didn't know until, you know, the baby would be born and what that journey would look like. So it was a scary few days, and she had a few decelerations that were concerning in the morning, and they came in and said, we're ready, you know, let's schedule the C-section. That way we're not rushing you in emergently and you can't be awake. And of course, for me, you know, 7 years ago, it wasn't COVID. And this meant that my favorite nurse, who had been amazing during my days leading up to the C-section, was able to be with me. I remember she was hugging me when, you know, before we went in, and she was in one of the pictures that we showed earlier. And most importantly, my husband was able to come in with me for the C-section. So that was fantastic. And our daughter was born weighing 3 pounds, 3 ounces, which was actually bigger. You know, the days leading up, they do specific ultrasounds, and they had anticipated she would be weighing around 2 pounds. So at that size, a whole pound bigger, it was like she was huge to them. They were so excited. And it also, during the C-section, they discovered that I have a bicornuate uterus. So it's often referred to as a heart-shaped uterus. And this was the reason for the growth restriction. So it was kind of a discovery at the same time as to why this had happened. We sort of saw her really quickly as she came out. And then, like you said, you know, she was rushed off to the NICU, and it's those like foggy hours afterwards that feel so long, and you're sort of so disoriented and asking, you know, what's going on. You haven't seen your baby yet. And then those hours later, when we finally got to see her, we were able to reach through the isolate and hold, you know, her little hand. And just like you, because we weren't ready yet, we hadn't decided on a name for our baby. So the morning of the C-section, we decided on Alexa Hope. And this is before the Google Alexa, so it wasn't as common or known. And we chose Alexa because it means defender of mankind in Greek. And like you said about Arya, under the circumstances, we wanted our girl to be a strong warrior. And we chose Hope as well, because in the days leading up, we kept holding on to hope that everything was going to be okay. And we certainly named her well. During her stay in the NICU, she proved to be quite the fierce little warrior. I finally got to hold her at the end of the second day in the NICU. She was already off the CPAP, which had been helping her breathe. And that moment that the nurse put her on my chest and I finally got to kiss her little head and tell her I loved her, it's probably one of the best moments of my life. As you described, we couldn't, you know, hold her for more than an hour every day if everything had been going smoothly. So me and my husband would kind of, you know, trade off who got to hold her and who needed it more. It's like you said, the day I was discharged, it's the worst feeling. You're leaving the hospital. It's this hole, it's this emptiness inside you. And I certainly cried the whole way home, and it was quite inconsolable that day. We then sort of got into a routine of waking up every 3 hours, even in the night, and I would pump and my husband would clean all of the little equipment, and then that would start over again. And for me, it was like my mission to pump as much as I could and bring that little liquid gold to the hospital with us. And that was being administered to her in small quantities through a feeding tube. So in the morning, we would pack our lunch. And at the time, I lived about 45 minutes away from the hospital. So we would head out and spend the day there. And it is, like you said, it's disorienting, the space in the NICU. You're watching your baby so small, sort of helpless in the isolate, and they're all connected. And you're watching this monitor, looking at the stats, just hoping everything stays good. And there's these alarms that go off, and you hear them from other babies that are in the NICU and from your own. And I think you can attest to that too. You hear the alarm bells after when you leave. And I think anyone who's been in the NICU, you remember that sound and you keep hearing it. And after you're gone, you get to know all the nurses. You can even call them in the middle of the night to check in and see how your baby's doing. And there is just the most incredible nurses and staff who work in the NICU, and you get to become so close to them. You lean on them. They're just an incredible trust that's formed as they're taking care of your baby when you can't. They helped us show us for the first time how to change her mini diaper amongst all the wires that she was connected to, give her first little bath. And she got to graduate into wearing clothes and move from isolate to the cot and so many more, sort of steps. As it wasn't COVID for us, our daughter, when she was in the NICU, we were so fortunate to have met other parents that were there, and you formed just this immediate bond with people going through something that can only be understood by someone else who's living it or who has lived it. I know one first meeting my husband had with another father whose twins were in the NICU. They had just met, went outside to go get some fresh air. And he said they just both sat outside and they started crying together. And he said they felt like they hadn't been able to sort of let that out. They were trying to be strong for their partners. We also got to meet the parents of a little guy whose isolate was right next to our daughters, and they had been there longer than us, and they just became an amazing source of support. And we instantly connected with them. And their little guy even had the exact same due date that Alexa had. And he was her very first friend and still is to this day. And I know we're going to be connected with them forever. After many ups and downs and feeling like our time in the NICU would never come to an end, like you said, that few steps forward to the steps back, feeling sometimes like I couldn't make it through another day, let alone another week. The monitors we were relying on got turned off. And after 40 days in the NICU, Alexa came home with us. And I really wanted to share my story because I don't know how many doctors and people along the way told me how right I was to have trusted in my gut, that feeling that I had that something wasn't right. And that if I hadn't, that there was a good chance that I wouldn't have my daughter. And my husband actually tells her all the time now that she's older that mommy saved your life. We have these instincts as mothers, even before our babies are born. And I really believe, in listening to yourself and in trusting in that gut, that feeling.
Thank you so much, Julia, for sharing. It's not easy to share these stories. It's not easy to relive these stories, I find. So thank you so much for being here and being vulnerable with me. It certainly makes it easier for me to talk about it, to have you here, which is really the basis of a lot of our perinatal mental health program with the Royal. It really is about peer support. It's about people coming together, sharing space, and sharing their perspectives and experiences together. So I'm really thankful we were able to do this today. We have some questions to go through.
Yeah, Elyse, I think you touched on it a little bit. Do you want to delve in a little bit on how you feel COVID played a role in your NICU journey and your experience?
Yeah, so I'm very lucky to have actually had quite a few friends who went through the NICU experience. Maybe not as many who have gone through the NICU experience during COVID. And it really did change, I think, the experience from what they described to me to what I was able to have. So in terms of our NICU experience, like I said, we gave birth April 3rd, and she was admitted into the NICU. So it really was the beginning of COVID. The day I gave birth was actually the first outbreak of COVID at the Civic. So we got to experience that first milestone as well. Not one we wanted, but the one we had. And it really meant that there were like a lot of rules in place that, and some of them still exist to help protect the babies. It's interesting. All the photos I sent you to included that slideshow have me without a mask on, which is wild to think. I don't know why I didn't send the majority of the time we were in there. We had to wear masks, but for the first week or so, parents didn't have to wear masks. But I think because I sent you some from when she was born and then some from when we left, that's why I'm not wearing a mask. But for the majority of the time, I was wearing a mask. So one of the rules that was in place was that you couldn't have both parents in at the same time. It was one parent in at a time. Other rules included not being able to come and go. So you could come and you could stay as long as you could handle, but that you couldn't leave and then return, which meant that you couldn't eat. And because of the mask, which I'm not wearing in the photos, but I promise you I was wearing the majority of the time that we were there, you also really couldn't drink water because it wasn't really appropriate to be like, I'm going to take my mask off while all of these 2-pound babies are in the room. So what that really meant was, normally from what I heard from parents and what I'm hearing from you as well, Julia, is that you would like kind of go and camp out all day. But for myself, and you told the story about pumping, you're pumping every 2 to 3 hours. You can't physically pump more than 3 times without eating a meal. You're starving and you're thirsty. And so that was really difficult, is that you could only ever be there for at most 6 hours, and you can never be there with your partner. And so we didn't actually get to parent together. I didn't even get to see my partner with his daughter until she came home on the 39th day of her life. And so that was really difficult. And it's hard to describe the connection and the bonding that you make when you're going through first. The first time you change a diaper, we didn't do that together. The first time we both bathed her, we didn't do that together. The first time we held our baby, we didn't do that together. The first time she breastfed or was fed by bottle, we didn't do that together. All of these things that you do as a family, depending on what your family looks like, we didn't get to do together. So it did change that. And I think we still now we really take pride in doing things together, and it probably stems from that. The other piece was that it was terrifying. I was so scared that she was going to get COVID, or that I was going to get COVID and bring it in and make the entire NICU sick. This was, I think, one of the, try not to cry, I think it's one of the hardest parts of the whole thing, was this idea that you could cause harm to your child. When you leave, you almost feel like you're abandoning your child. And then to think that to visit your child, every time you visit your child, you're potentially exposing them to something that could harm them or harm others. And I think that is still something that I'm coping with. It's still something that keeps me up at night. I have recurring dreams of different scenarios where I'm either leaving my child or causing harm to my child. And I think that is something clearly I need to continue to work through. So COVID really changed things. But in all of that, there were so many good people who kept showing up. I talk about the nurses nonstop. They showed up. They had a smile under their mask. They, really did keep us focused on hope. And I think it's so beautiful that Alexa's middle name is Hope, because you need it. You need it in the NICU, and there's no shortage of it from those nurses who really do try to instill that they do see babies get better every single day.
Absolutely. And the things like while you were in the NICU, while you were in the hospital, that people did sort of to comfort you, or that they said that really helped while you were there?
Absolutely. The first thing was definitely food, and I included the photos. The food was a very big part of my life there for a while. So not only did many people drop things off, but I was lucky enough that one of my very good friends, and she's also a board member for the birth center, is a director at the Ottawa hospital, and she couldn't come into the unit, but the day that Aria was born, she was in the hospital and she was able to drop off to the nurses outside the unit a grilled cheese with bacon and a coffee from Tim Hortons. And they were in the slideshow because to me, I needed them. And that was the best thing I can remember in terms of being like, this is what I need right now. And so I think grilled cheese, it was always a comfort food, but now it's definitely a comfort food. Also preemie clothes, those were pictured too. It was impossible during COVID to get preemie clothes. I mean, it's hard anyways, but during COVID, it was almost impossible. And a friend, Melissa Cotton, I have to say thank you to her. She dropped off like 12 different outfits, which literally were the only preemie clothes we had. And we were able to donate them on to other parents when we were done with them. I saw a lactation consultant because Aria didn't eat at the breast until about 8 weeks because she was just too weak and was on oxygen. It was too hard for her, and physically she had an oxygen machine on. So it took about 8 weeks, and we had a great lactation consultant named Sonia Boersma. And then I was lucky that my former midwifery practice partner, Kelly Scott, had a baby at 27 weeks, don't quote me on that, in October of 2019, so right before we went through it. And she was a huge help, just giving me a preemie book, being able to help with breastfeeding questions. She was just a huge help. And I'm so lucky that we had her. On the flip side, I think we've talked about it before. Were there things that people did that were maybe not so helpful, Julia?
Yes, we've definitely shared this between each other because I think people are well-intentioned, but sometimes don't always think about maybe what they're saying before they say it. And I think you experienced this sort of same comment. Someone had told me, "You're so lucky. You don't have to wake up in the middle of the night and someone else gets to take care of your baby for you." And when you are waking up in the middle of the night to pump instead of waking up to feed your actual baby, and all you wish and hope for during that time is to be able to take care of your baby, it's something that is really hurtful and stuck in my memory for sure.
And let's talk about that pump life, because no one talks about it. Certainly when I was a midwife, I did not talk about it enough. And if I were to go back to practice, I would talk about it. I would definitely talk about it. You wake up every 2 to 3 hours and you pump. And instead of having that cuddle with that baby, you have this awkward relationship with this yellow cow sucking.
Yeah.
And you have to get up. You have to put the milk away. You have to clean the bottles. You have to do all of the things. And it takes, because it's at the beginning, not the end of your experience, it takes like 45 minutes to do the whole process. And again, you're pumping every 2 to 3 hours. So you end and then you have about 2 hours and then
you're
you have to
sterilizing all the little pieces and equipment. And oh yeah, it's something I think that a lot of people that have experienced that can relate to. It's a special not experience for sure.
Absolutely. I think it's just so hard, right? Because I do think, as you say, people are not ill-intentioned. It's always hard to know what to say, but that piece of like, oh, well, at least someone else is taking care of your baby, you get a break. It's so hurtful, but it is always important to remember that people are also struggling to find the words to say. And I think in both our cases, we definitely saw that the intentions were good, but it does stick with you. It really was funny that we both, every single person I've talked to has experienced that comment specifically when their babies are in the NICU. So here's a PSA to anybody who's
don't
watching.
say it.
Don't say it. Don't do it.
If you kind of do if you knew then what you know now, is there anything you feel like you would do differently?
It's so hard, right? Like I think I would give myself a little bit more space, give myself a little more time. I think I'm still dealing with those emotions, one thing that we talked about was that lots of people gave me great advice to journal, and I didn't do it. And I wish I had. But in all fairness, I couldn't. Every day I would be like, today I'm going to journal. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to do it. I don't know if it was a mental health block. But of course, now I think it would have been very cathartic to be able to look back on that and process those feelings. So I think if somebody had the capacity to journal, I think it's great advice. And that's coming from someone who didn't do it and wishes that she had. How about you?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think about giving yourself the time and the space. Like for me, it took actually a few years after the birth of my daughter and sort of trying to conceive again. I had a few miscarriages as well as an ectopic pregnancy, and sort of dealing with those losses. I started seeing a psychologist who specializes in infertility and pregnancy. And I sort of uncovered that there was a lot also from the experience of my daughter being born prematurely and sort of all those unexpected challenges and experiences that are not the norm common that you get to have. That sort of, it came up for me, including, grieving the full pregnancy. I never got to experience, it's so common. You'll hear mothers, towards the end of the pregnancy, maybe they're complaining, oh, they're so big, they're uncomfortable, they can't wait for the baby to come out. It's just normal to say. For me, sometimes it can be triggering. I never got to live those experiences, never got to live through my, the full pregnancy or the common normal parenting experiences that a lot of people didn't get to have. So I would have started maybe that healing process a lot sooner. And I think it's relevant now for people too that may be experiencing grief for the pregnancy or even the maternity leave that they hoped or wanted to have that they can't have right now because of the pandemic that we're in. And I certainly know, other people that have, NICU experiences and prematurity can cause, like we talked about, so much stress, anxiety, fears. There's even some people that have some PTSD, even just driving in front of the hospitals can be triggering and bring back a lot of those emotions. So I just feel giving yourself that time, that space, we're moving forward to, sort of survive and go through the motions. And we have to look into ourselves a little bit too and give ourselves some time to heal.
Absolutely. I think it's so great that you bring up that grief. Because I do think it's important to mourn, and that has to do with prematurity in the NICU, as you say, but it also has to do with when people, when their birth plans really change, right? Like I said at the beginning, I like to say that mine is like what could go wrong will go wrong. But of course, I've seen lots of clients who had a very specific idea of what they wanted for their birth and what that birth was going to mean to them. And when plans change or when circumstances change, it can be really hard because you want to grieve, or you should grieve, I think, the what could have been or what you wanted. And when we don't take the time to do it, it almost does turn into trauma. And I think that COVID is going to do that to people. So we talked about this before, that I always feel so silly that one of the things that bugs me the most is that I spent all this money buying maternity clothing and I never really got to wear it. I never really looked that pregnant. Even the photo that I posted at 31 weeks, I'm like pushing my belly out, trying to look pregnant in those photos. So I definitely look more pregnant in that photo than I think I did walking around. I'm also wearing like a tight shirt in it just to try to show it off. So I never really got to wear my maternity clothes. I didn't get my baby shower. I didn't get my midwife at my birth. I didn't get my birth center birth. I didn't get, let's say more importantly than the midwife, maybe, it might have been a maybe, my partner, Dustin, I didn't get him at my birth. We didn't get to meet our baby together. We didn't get to go home together for 38 days. We didn't get to breastfeed exclusively from the very beginning. there are so many things I feel like we didn't get. Heck, I didn't even get a first birthday party for her. We did that on Zoom too. But the photos were fire, definitely. But, you know, it's important to mourn and grieve the things that you've lost, because I think from that you're able to move on. And again, to bring it back to our Royal program in partnership with the Birth Center, that gives a safe space for people like you and I to talk about what's transpired and to try to, you know, come to peace by sharing with your peers and listening to your peers. And I do think it's so important. It's such a great point you raised. One piece of my story that I didn't get to talk about because I forgot, because I started crying about the car seat, was the phone call. We've talked about the phone call to the NICU. And so I want to share that for any parent who's maybe going through it. When you have a NICU baby, they're obviously in the NICU and you are not, and you're at home. And hopefully, like we've said, you're not sleeping through the night, but you're in your own bed. And typically you would call in the morning to see how the baby's night went the night before. And for us, that was the most triggering, anxiety inducing piece of having a baby in the NICU. Like it, you know, you call and they go, "Hi, how are you?" And then you're like anticipating, what happened to my baby? Did they finish their bottles? Did they go up in their bottles? Did they get a new IV, PICC line, whatever could go wrong? Did they desat, which you become very familiar with those words? You know, did something happen that's going to make them stay another 7 days? Because what is it called when they have an episode? So when they have a desat and it is longer,
Resets the clock.
Yeah, it resets the clock for how long they have to stay. If they have this episode, it's 7 days. Doesn't matter how good they are during those like next 3 days. If they have it once, it resets the clock for 7 days. And then, you know, my baby's definitely not coming home for another 7 days, right? So you're always anticipating and dreading that phone call. And I just think that for people to know that A, that phone call exists, B, it is anxiety inducing to every single person that we talk to. That is definitely the part that triggered me the most.
Absolutely. And for me, I leaned a lot. There's a group that exists in Ottawa. It's Parents of Preemies Ottawa. And they have a group on Facebook. Back in my time at the NICU, they would meet up at the hospital. So you can connect with other parents. But they also have a group, and you know, I still have it. And it's what makes me passionate about our collaboration with the Royal and how important that peer-to-peer support groups is, because you see other people going through the journey, you feel less alone, you know, in that Parents of Preemies Ottawa group. People will share, you know, we just got to the NICU, and then, you know, like your friend who you were able to kind of talk to who had experienced that, sharing advice and knowing that, you know, it's hard, you're going to get through it, and you are, you know, hopefully going to go home with your baby, and you kind of share in their joys too, those pictures when they're graduating from the NICU. And I just think that it's so important, and the work that, you know, Nancy is doing with the perinatal wellness groups and support groups here are so important. And I'm so happy that we, you know, opening up this conversation too.
Absolutely. So that brings us, I think, probably to the end. I was looking on our Facebook chat. We see very many very sweet, thoughtful words from people watching, but I don't see any questions. So I think that's the end. Nancy, do you have any words to share?
So I have a couple of words. I just wanted to thank you both for being so generous and brave. And I also want to acknowledge the emotional work that went into this. So thinking about your memories, looking at your pictures, and sharing this with other people to help them with their stories, I think is very generous of the both of you. And I thank you very much. We've had comments about how strong you are. I can't imagine how difficult this must have been for you both. Thank you for sharing. Your stories are so moving, very encouraging words. And as you both probably know, we do tend to get comments and questions after the fact. So Julia and Elyse will be watching that, and any questions, I'm sure they would love to answer them for you. And I just wanted to mention again that this Facebook Live is part of a collaboration between the Ottawa Birth and Wellness Center and Women's Mental Health. So I encourage you to take a look at the Ottawa Birth and Wellness Center's Facebook page. We do have other Facebook Lives on a variety of different topics. I'm sure you will find something that interests you. As well, we have, as Elyse and Julia mentioned, wellness groups. So we have peer wellness groups that are on Tuesday mornings from 11 till 12 and Wednesday afternoons from 2 until 3. We also have journaling as a wellness tool, which is on Tuesdays at 1 p.m. The next one starts in June. And we will be starting a Life with a Baby peer-led group as well. So if you're interested in any of those groups, you can reach out to me. We'll put my email at the bottom in the information section. And again, I wanted to thank you, Julia and Elyse, for today. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Nancy.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who watched.